Thanks everybody for joining us here. Apologies for the delay. We had some technical issues, but we're very happy to have Chris Wüthrich here giving us a talk about laws beyond space-time. Chris did his PhD with John Ehrman at Pittsburgh, but before that he had done a theoretical physics master's in Bern. And then he went to UCSD for many years, and then has also been now in Switzerland for 7 years. Is that right?
That's right.
In Geneva. Yes. And yeah, well, take it away, Chris. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Enrique, for the very nice introduction, and thanks to the Oxford community of philosophy of physics for having me. I'm going to talk today about laws beyond space-time. With that, what I want to express is the idea that, as I've been working on the philosophy of quantum gravity for many years now, one of the most discussed problems or issues that arises in philosophy of quantum gravity is the possible absence of space-time from the fundamental level of what there is. And one thing I'm particularly interested is in trying to sort of work out what the possible implications of that would be. And the main thesis, okay, well, it doesn't work anymore. Okay, the main thesis I want to defend today is the idea that this suggestion coming from quantum gravity that at the fundamental level there is no space-time will have implications for our analysis of laws of nature. In particular, the ways in which maybe not all extant conceptions of space-time, but some of the major ones anyway, will stand in need of a rather radical reconsideration, if that's right, if that's borne out, the non-fundamentality of space-time. And I'm going to, for that, rely on the material that I have in a paper with Vincent Lam, in a joint work of a paper with the same title. So in case you're interested. The plan for today will be the following. First, I will be arguing that the non-fundamentality of space-time implies, if it's right, I mean, that we don't know, but we assume it for today, implies that an analysis of laws of nature should not depend on space-time and should not require the fundamental existence of space-time, because if it does, then it seems to be in trouble for reasons I will explain. Secondly, I will show, or try to show anyway, how the standard Humean, and by that I mean basically the Lewisian or Lewis type analysis of laws of nature, does depend on space-time. Then I will try to take a sort of a somewhat bigger view and think about what it is that is the core, the heart of Humeanism. So what are the central elements of a Humean analysis, of a Humean metaphysics of laws of nature, such that if you don't have those elements on board, you can really not claim by any reasonable stretch of the imagination that you're still a Humean. So I want to try and state what it is, in my view, that makes a Humean. Then I will show how this idea of Humeanism stands in a tension with my adopted form of naturalism. And as a matter of fact, as we will see, as will gradually become clearer, this tension between naturalism and between Humeanism will actually be largely independent of the original concern. It's sort of a more general problem for Humeanism. I will also consider some ways in which this can be navigated. And then in the second, but shorter second half, I will continue to non-human conceptions of the laws of nature. And I will show how the standard, or some of the standard conceptions of both primitivist approaches to laws of nature and dispositionalist approaches to laws of nature rely also on space or space-time or time, and in that sense may be in trouble if the original assumption of today's talk is borne out. Or maybe to put it in a nutshell, the non-human approaches rely on some form of nomic production. There's some process, some causal process of production according to the laws, or which is what the laws are doing when they are governing. That is the central idea of these non-human approaches, one form or another. And if that's right, there is the worry, of course, that this production presupposes, in some sense, a sort of a spatial conception of a system that evolves temporally, being produced in some way or another. So if we want to make these non-human approaches independent of space-time, we will have to come up with some form of, I still call it nomic production, that is not temporal anyway. Maybe we should better find a different word then for that altogether. Okay, then I'll conclude. Good. Now, Larry Sklar, almost 40 years ago, has expressed what many people have assumed without further consideration, namely that the assumption that there is space-time is something of the most natural, most elementary, most basic, most intuitive starting points of any philosophizer. And as a matter of fact, in many philosophical considerations that have nothing or not much to do with philosophy of physics, you just assume that there's space and time. You help yourself to that. And as you can see in this quote, this is, it's not really, sort of a pointer. Okay. Anyway, this idea is expressed here in this quote. Sklar asks, a world not in time is almost inconceivable, a world not spatial, except to some Platonists, or maybe more accurately to some Pythagoreans. Such a world seems to be devoid of real being altogether. That means of physical existence. If anything exists physically, it is those things which exist in space and time. Aristotle has used this as a definition of real being in the sense of physical existence. So if you don't have space and time, then what do you have? Maybe some mathematical structures. That's what you have. Okay. Now the problem is, however, and this is something I've been studying with Nick Huggett in a book which is still forthcoming, in other publications as well. If you look at various proposals in quantum gravity, and I'm not going to be doing that in any detail here, but if you analyze them, then the striking thing, as disparate, as different, as distinct as they may be, they seem to share that their space and time, in some sense, as you find it in general relativity, is not going to be there in the fundamental ontology. The structures that are postulated by these theories are, in some relevant sense, non-spatial and or non-temporal. So they either presuppose this non-spatial temporality or they entail it. They certainly differ to the degree to which the fundamental structures are non-spatial and non-temporal. And I mean, this is part of the project in this book, to go through three major approaches and really try to work out in some detail which spatial aspects and which temporal aspects are lost fundamentally in these approaches. I'm not going to go into the detail here, but the important thing is that space-time, of course, exists at our scales. Of course, our world, the world of human experience, is spatial and temporal. So that means space and time, if it's not built into the ontology of fundamental physics, has to somehow arise or emerge from that fundamental physics. Just as tables and chairs and the temperature in this room and the liquidity and the dynamics of flowing of the water in the River Thames and so on and so forth is somehow arising from the fundamental properties of what makes up the river, the tables and chairs, and so on and so forth. Somehow these fundamental degrees of freedom have to conspire and to bring about to collectively behave such as for space-time to emerge. So it's an emergent phenomenon. Okay. Now, whether that will be borne out in quantum gravity at the end of the day, we don't know. But for today, I do assume that it will be. And I want to understand what that implies for our conceptions of laws of nature. The first thing that is important to realize here is that it implies that space-time is contingent, physically contingent. In the sense that if it's really the case that the collective behavior of the fundamental degrees of freedom is what brings about the spatiality or temporality of the world, then of course these fundamental degrees of freedom could behave in ways such that that are not conducive to the emergence of space and time. Just as fundamental particles may be in states such as not to constitute a flowing river or a table or a chair or whatever. So in that sense, whether space-time emerges, therefore, is non-contingent. That's really the problem. It's not at what level of existence, in some sense, it may or may not exist, but it means that there will be some physically possible worlds, according to these theories, in which there is no space-time. Okay? So I basically just said all of this. So for that reason, an analysis of laws of nature that depends on the existence of space-time would fail in those physically possible worlds. It wouldn't be possible to apply that analysis of laws at those physically possible worlds. Maybe we would have to say there are no laws in those cases, or we just wouldn't know what to say for those physically possible worlds. So an analysis which takes naturalism seriously, I suggest, should need to cover all those cases, because it would be strange to then say whether or not we have laws of nature in such and such a fundamental approach to quantum gravity depends on the particular ways in which the fundamental degrees of freedom happen to be in. I'd say whether or not there are laws of nature becomes a state-dependent affair. And that seems strange. Physicists, the way they will want to speak about laws of nature, will certainly not be happy with that. For that reason, if that reason is taken seriously, then I think the analysis of laws of nature that we're going to apply or favor at the end of the day should not depend on the existence of space-time. Okay, so I hope that was that was the first point I wanted to make. Now, I'm not going to belabor this too much. You're all familiar, I assume, with the basic junction here, the basic options we have for different analyses of laws of nature. But I nevertheless want to bring this up because it shows what I think to be the central issue. It's not so much that Humean versus non-Humean analysis of laws of nature assume that the world is completely different. But what they assume is a difference in what is fundamental and what depends on what. For a Humean, what's fundamental are the particular matter of facts that obtain at the world. And it is those facts which then determine what the laws of nature are, which can be considered, if you want, some sort of summary of the regularities that you find in those facts. For a non-Humean analysis, of course, it's reverse. It's the laws of nature, which are prior, metaphysically speaking, and in that they govern, or in some sense determine, at least some of the particular facts that obtain at that world. So that's important. Now, it means for a Humean analysis to be free of any problematic dependence on space-time, the articulation of what it is to be a fact here has to be free of space-time. That should not presuppose space-time. And maybe the way in which this determination, that's going to be less of a problem. It's going to be the problem to state these facts without relying on space-time. And here, it's going to be a problem to state what the laws are in a way that's free of space-time, and then the way in which they do the governing that does not presuppose a spatial or temporal background. Okay, good. So first, Humean laws. The question is a Humean analysis of laws of nature viable in a world that is not fundamentally spatiotemporal? And you might think, well, the standard Humean analysis is something like the best systems analysis. Isn't that straightforwardly not depending on space and time? You can just say, like, well, you give me the best system theory, right? That's my best system. And whatever the axioms are, that's going to be the fundamental laws. Done, no problem. So if the fundamental physical axioms, are those of string theory or loop quantum gravity or anything like that, so be it. That's the laws, no problem. Well, the best systems analysis gives you a recipe for, given the fundamental occurrent facts, how to get to the laws, right? But we still need to sort of say or state what the particular facts are, the occurrent facts at the world. And the way to do that is, of course, to use, or at least in a Lewisian approach, is to use this idea of Humean supervenience. This is a very famous quote, so I'm going to go through this quickly. But Lewis said the idea is that all there is to a world is a vast mosaic of local matters of particular fact. It's a pattern, structure, arranged thing. It's one little thing after another. We have geometry, maybe we have points of space-time itself, maybe just point-sized bits of matter, and so on and so forth. What we certainly have is relations of spatiotemporal distance. So there are local particular matters of fact, which are, however, arranged in a mosaic. And that arrangement, the arranging relations, are spatiotemporal relations. Okay. So we have an arrangement of qualities, that is all. There's no difference without difference in the arrangement of qualities, and all else supervenes on that. So this aspect of arranging qualities is absolutely central to this Lewisian type approach. Okay. It's the spatiotemporal relations, as it were, which weave the facts into a carpet or into a mosaic. I actually prefer the metaphor of a carpet, because in a carpet it's clear to me that there's like weaving relations between the different local facts. In a mosaic, maybe not. I don't know. I mean, it's just a metaphor. It's not that important, but it's important that there are such relations. They're not completely unstructured. It's not just an unstructured heap of local facts somehow. Okay. So these basic occurrent facts metaphysically precede then all the modal and nomic facts. It's from that basis from which we start out and try to identify what the best system is that sort of captures the regularities in that arrangement of local states of affairs. Okay, now, if we assume that some sort of theory of quantum gravity will born out to be the right theory, a true theory perhaps even, or at least to a very good approximation, and that it turns out that space-time therefore is not fundamental, then it seems as if you use space-time as the as that type of relation, spatiotemporal relations, which are the world-made relation, which create and unify and divide or isolate one world from another, then that whole procedure does not seem to be working anymore. And it seems as if our actual world is described like that, then maybe even our actual world may not be metaphysically possible according to this picture. Sorry, that's the wrong direction. All right. So we certainly wouldn't want the actual world to come out as metaphysically impossible. We also wouldn't want many of these other intuitively metaphysically possible ones to come out as metaphysically impossible. In particular, we wouldn't want any world that physics considers physically possible to be metaphysically impossible, which it would be if there would be some worlds in which there is no space-time. Those would not be metaphysically possible in this view. Good. So, you sort of, I'm sure you already see the trouble where I'm trying to get at for human supervenience. I'm not the first person to point out problems or some tension between human supervenience and fundamental physics. There is the long known problem, of course, of human supervenience and how to reconcile it with quantum non-locality. Quantum non-locality is a really rather well-established fact of fundamental physics. It's extremely hard to evade the conclusion that there's a sense in which our world is non-local. So if the fundamental basis of what there is only contains local states of affairs, that seems to be problematic, or just not true, according to our best physics. Now, Humeans have replied to this charge, and they have tried to sort of fix human supervenience in different ways. One way is perhaps to take on board non-local facts, or some relational facts between different places, different spatial-temporal locations, particularly some sort of entanglement relations, things like this. Now, I don't want to take a stance on that debate, but let's accept that maybe the Humean can reply to that. There are at least some replies to these problems which seem to some extent practicable. The problem here is how we can go beyond that. How can we not just include maybe non-local facts, but facts which do not at all appear to be expressible in spatial-temporal terms? So this is going the wrong direction again. This is now the problem with quantum gravity, if you want, and in a way it goes further than that of quantum non-locality. Because it seems now if the world is fundamentally non-spatial temporal, what it even means to be a spatial temporal arrangement doesn't seem to be stateable in those worlds. That there's just we don't have the relevant physical properties and relations at those worlds to say that there is an arrangement. There is no arrangement in that sense. So the mosaic and carpet metaphors should be given up in those cases. Even if that mosaic included perhaps non-local facts or other things to accommodate quantum physics. All right, so that's the sense in which, and maybe that was a little bit longer than was necessary, but that's the sense in which the standard approach to Humeanism is in trouble. The best system idea as such is not challenged, it seems, but you need to somehow state what the fundamental, the basic or current facts in the world are without taking recourse to the existence of space or time. That's the challenge. So it's maybe not a sort of, even though prima facie it looks as if there's no problem, it turns out that there is some non-trivial problem.
Quickly clarificatory question. Do you also mean to rule out nearest neighbor relationships, because that is well captured by the mosaic, right? So just Or do you mean only spatiotemporal? Or just to clarify.
So is the question whether nearest neighbor relations are excluded by approaches to quantum gravity?
Yeah.
Or, well, so which spatial temporal aspects are really off the table in a way? To what extent space and time don't exist fundamentally will depend on the details of the approach to quantum gravity, of course. And as the book I'm still writing will hopefully make clear, is going into some detail there, it's not the same for each different approach. In causal set theory, for instance, there's no sense, no spatial relations whatsoever which are fundamental. There's something that looks like a temporal relation, but no spatial relations whatsoever. No nearest neighbor relation or any other relation that could be interpreted as spatial in some sense seems to be present at all, fundamentally speaking, and only will arise, both the topological or geometrical spatial properties will only arise at the non-fundamental level. So if that's the case, then you should not rely in your statement of the fundamental occurrent facts here on even nearest neighbor relations or any topological notions or anything like that. Okay.
Chris, do you like more light? Yeah, that's what I ask.
I have enough light. I don't need to see much, but I just, as long as I have this in my hand. Okay. So the question is, how would we do that? Can we still somehow articulate what it is to be this fundamental mosaic or carpet, this arrangement or whatever it's going to be, whatever metaphor you want to use, the fundamental facts, if in a non-spatial temporal world. It's important that we have something. This is what I call glue. Okay, I like metaphors. It's a gluing metaphor. We need a world-mate relation. That's what does the gluing, saying that these two things, they inhabit the same world because they stand in such and such world-making relation. I need some glue to glue them together into one world. For Lewis, it's space-time relations, spatial-temporal relations, or perhaps some generalization thereof. It's just a job. So for a world to be unified and isolated from other worlds, so we also want to say, if two things do not stand in this world-making relation, then they are not inhabitants of the same world. So they're unifying and isolating. These particular contingent facts, they require this kind of weave or glue. Okay. So what kind of relations could take over this gluing job from the spatial temporal relations? Now, the relations should arguably be appropriately external so that you can freely recombine the things. I mean, this is the Humean idea. I mean, what is Humeanism? Humeanism is the idea that there are no necessary connections. This is what Hume said, how he expressed it. Maybe that's not quite how we would put it today, but that will be written into the Humean approach in the sense that you have fundamental degrees of freedom of one form or another that you can freely recombine. There's no necessity about those two things having to be together or never, so that it's impossible for these two things to be together. Okay, that's the sense in which there shouldn't be necessary connections. They could be or could not be, both is possible. Right? So they should be freely recombinable in that sense. Of course, if we take naturalism seriously, they should be a posteriori. That is, we cannot sort of before, in some logical sense, before scientific inquiry, sit down into our armchair and think like, okay, what could these gluing relations be? Lewis did that, and he thought spatiotemporal relations, or some appropriate generalization thereof, would be sufficiently general and harmless to do that. And it has turned out that maybe that was a problem. That was a wrong choice. So, what a new supervenience base for the naturalistic Humean project will be then, will then turn out on the favorite approach to quantification, because it's a posteriori, depending on what fundamental physics will look like, presumably will have some influence on what these, gluing relations could be or should be. But now this gets us into the trouble, the more general trouble that Humeanism has when combined with naturalism that I alluded to at the beginning. Because any assumption about what the gluing, what the favorite assumption approach to quantum gravity will be, will of course make a difference of what we take to be the occurrent facts and on what connects them. So by virtue of what do they exist in the same world as the spatiotemporal relations in charge of that task before, they no longer offer that duty. Now, it's important that these relations, whatever they're going to be, are not nomic or modal relations in some sense, because otherwise there would be the worry that this would frustrate the human project. There would be in some form necessary, or as I will say, nomically charged relations between the fundamental existence. And that's exactly what we want to avoid. So in a slogan, we will want some glue that comes without any nomic voltage, so that we can freely recombine stuff. So it's, a human project is okay. Okay, now very briefly, here are two approaches to quantum gravity and what they take to be what there is, what maybe these fundamental things could look like. I understand it's a little bit difficult to convey what these approaches are in a talk of 1 hour, where that's not the main point I'm trying to make. But just to give you a little bit of a sense of what the structures look like when we look to quantum gravity. For instance, in loop quantum gravity, we have spin network states. Spin network states, in some sense, have a good claim to be the fundamental states that there are. So there is a system, a physical system that's there, and that system can be in so-called spin network states. Spin network states are states in a Hilbert space that they form a basis, which gives us a natural geometric interpretation. So in that sense, they're still somewhat spatial. Namely, they could be interpreted to be combinatorial structures like this, where each node here represents a little atom of space, if you want, and each of the edges connecting two nodes can be thought of as an adjacency relation between these two fundamental chunks of space. Now, the reason why we have to be very cautious with this geometric interpretation is, or what the main reason, I think, maybe not the only one, the main reason why we have to be cautious about this is that, generically speaking, the fundamental structures are going to be in superposition states of these geometrically well-defined things. So they give us the basis, but they, of course, generically will not describe the state of the fundamental thing. Anyway, something like this is what there is, fundamentally speaking. The laws are going to be the axioms or the theorems of the theories in loop quantum gravity that describe these structures. In causal set theory, and even though the picture looks very similar, I guess in some sense, is a very different approach to quantum gravity. Namely, an approach in which there are fundamental entities, fundamental events, you can call them. You shouldn't think too spatiotemporally when you think of events here. Events is a technical thing. That these events being partially ordered by a relation of causal connectability. Meaning that, this is an event that could causally precede that event, but not this event, because there's no connection there. Space is going to be something like a maximal set of horizontal, you cut the structure horizontally to give a spatial relation. You can also already see why I said there's no spatial relations, because the fundamental relations are really just the purple lines here, nothing else. So horizontally, as it were, there's no fundamental relations there. It's not spatial at all. Anyway, what's fundamentally there are these events with their causal connectability relations. That's it. Okay. And as laws, presumably generically in worlds like that, what you will get is something like the axioms that of causal set theory, which describe these structures, even though, of course, in unusually simple cases or particularly symmetric cases, it's not just, there might be some other axioms that come out as laws of the Humean approach. All right. Now, the problem is that what guarantees that the facts that I describe, as I just did to you, these structures of quantum gravity, that these are non-nomic, that they're not nomically charged, or there's no nomic voltage for that description, to use that metaphor again. What guarantees that? And that's the problem, because we will want to adopt something like a principle of free recombination here to have no necessary connections. The elementary entities should, which count as facts or states of affairs, they should be freely recombinable with one another in order to generate all the different ways in which the world could be. And as I already mentioned, philosophers like Lewis do this pre-theoretically, pre-scientifically. They do this in an a priori way, but a naturalist shouldn't do that. It's the theories which should guide us when we identify what the possible combinations of these fundamental things or the basic facts are. The fundamental events in causal set theory, for instance, they cannot be combined in any way you like. You have to accept the rules of the laws of causal set theory in a way. But of course, that's exactly the problem for the Humeans, because that means they're nomically charged in that way. I look to the laws of causal set theory to determine which combinations are possible and which ones are not. The recombinations, in other words, are not free. And that's a problem for the Humean. So, in those theories, the facts are not freely recombinable. They're only combinable in ways permitted by the theory. To invoke a theory to justify these possible recombinations seems to be amounting precisely on imposing laws on these basic facts. So that's a betrayal to the Humean idea of no necessary connections. And so that's the sense in which naturalistic Humanism, in a way, is this sort of almost self-defeating pair of positions. According to naturalism, we will have theoretical possibilities which in some sense are nomically charged. They're governed by what are considered to be the laws according to that theory. But on the other hand, in humanism, of course, we don't want any such necessary connections about particular matters of fact. So that is the basic tension that we have to sort of navigate here. And in my view, there is not going to be a solution according to which we can have sort of 100% naturalism and 100% humanism. In some ways, we have to find a trade-off. These two things trade off one another. Okay. Good. So, in other words, we have to, if we're naturalists, want to look to the fundamental theories to guide us what binds these particular matters of fact, to identify the glue, without accepting the theory fully, so to avoid the nomic charge again. Okay, so is there any hope that this tension can be navigated? Let's look at some ways maybe that are starting out from the way in which fundamental physics acts that may be giving us some promise to navigate this. For instance, we could say like, look, we take all the kinematically possible models of a theory as the metaphysically possibility. It's the kinematic structures which give us the glue, in a way. They generate the possible worlds. And then this is unproblematic because we haven't imposed the dynamical laws yet. It's the dynamical laws which then tell us which subset of these kinematic possibilities are going to be the dynamically possible worlds, the nomically possible world, thereby the physically possible worlds. Okay, now that must be pleasing to the naturalist, I think, because if the distinction between kinematics and dynamics is certainly one that's very, very eminent in physics. In many physical theories, there is such a natural distinction to be had. It seems to be very close to the way physics works. There are, however, some problems with an approach like that. The first problem is that you presuppose that there is such a natural distinction between kinematics and dynamics. And even though that's the case for many important physical theories, there is absolutely no guarantee that this will be the case for all fundamental physical theories. And in particular, in quantum gravity, it's not obvious that this can be maintained. In a way, it may be too naturalistic, namely in the sense that it may stay too close to a particular physical theory or a particular framework, a particular way of thinking about physical theories. That does not seem to really do justice to the full, extremely wide sort of umbrella of metaphysical possibilities, because it seems to rule out as possible worlds all those things which are not kinematically possible according to that theory. And that's an awful lot of worlds that are generally by metaphysicians considered to be metaphysically possible. So in that sense, it's a very, very naturalistic approach which rules out a lot of the things that metaphysicians want to keep. And it may be insufficiently Humean because there's a problem. Even though I explicitly use the language of laws only in connection with the dynamical laws, I think in a Humean view, that the kinematic structures, they are also giving rise to laws, namely to those axioms or theorems which describe the kinematic structure of a theory. They're not dynamical laws in the way that physicists often speak of laws of nature, but to a Humean, they are part of the theoretical basic assumptions that you buy into and therefore would naturally qualify as laws. So it's not clear that this really is, Humean in that sense. Okay, let's give it another try. We could say maybe the mistake was to focus on physical space. When Lewis thought about how to unify and isolate worlds, he was thinking too much of physical space. As naturalists, we should certainly be open to use other kinds of spaces, particularly because there's also independent reason, perhaps, in interpretations of quantum physics, for instance, to look to other spaces as the fundamental spaces to look at. Maybe configuration space, or Hilbert space, or something like that. It should be replacing physical space. Okay, good. Now, given that these theories of quantum gravity that will be of interest to us will be quantum theories at the end of the day, maybe that's the right way to go, because they will certainly have something like these kind of spaces. They're going to be there. So we could be starting out from those. So we use this other space, maybe a Hilbert space or a configuration space, as the foundation, that which generates the Humean supervenience space, the fundamental occurrent facts and possible ways in which the world could be in accordance to that. Now, that's an interesting and again, very naturalistic proposal, so I like it, but there are some severe limitations of that approach as well. So, for instance, in quantum physics, the first thing you learn is once you sort of got used to the very first Hilbert space that your professor introduced was maybe a two-dimensional Hilbert space when he talked about spin or something like that. All of a sudden you realize, the world is more complicated than that. In fact, if you have a different fundamental physical system with different or more degrees of freedom, as surely you should assume, then your Hilbert space will become much more complicated. As a matter of fact, it seems as if you first have to make an assumption about, quite specific assumption about what that system is like and what the fundamental degrees of freedom you have before you can even say, what kind of Hilbert space you have. So somehow focusing on one particular Hilbert space seems to rule out, for instance, that the world had 16 fundamental particles instead of the 17 that you assumed, or something like that. And it seems weird to think that, given that the world has 17 particles, it's somehow metaphysically impossible that it could have had only 16. So we would need some way of dealing with that, and without having to assume a particular configuration space or a particular Hilbert space. So that's the wrong direction. So you have to find a way to generalize this idea. But even if you do, it would still seem to make free recombination to some degree hostage to a particular theory, or maybe a family of theories, or some sort of theoretical framework, perhaps, raising again the worry that perhaps this is not sufficiently human anymore. Because even if you haven't talked about dynamics yet, or the different states that particular system could be in, and so on and so forth, and how it may evolve, nevertheless, you've made very substantive assumptions about that Hilbert space, which surely can be captured by some best system, some axioms describing that. Okay, one last proposal. You sort of start to see how that, the game is played here, I assume. One last proposal, which starts out from a proposal by Rasmus Jakslund in a recently published paper, where he took entanglement as the world-making relation. Instead of spatiotemporal relations, you start out from entanglement relations. So two systems are world mates if and only if they are entangled. That seems again to be a very naturalistic proposal, because entanglement is, of course, central in quantum physics. And as I said, we certainly assume the fundamental theory to be a quantum theory. So this would not be a crazy bet in that sense. So entanglement relations replace spatiotemporal relations as the glue we're seeking. Okay. However, of course, we would need to then show that the fundamental entities in our theory of quantum gravity are going to be systems which are generically entangled with one another. It would be metaphysically impossible for two systems or entities or degrees of freedom or whatever you have somehow to be there in the same world if they were not entangled. Necessarily, two systems have to be entangled, which inhabit the same world. So that's certainly a limitation. Again, I think it's promising, it's certainly naturalist. The question is whether recombinations of entanglement are not, again, governed by law, and therefore in the same way as the previous proposals are going to be non-Humean to a degree that could be disconcerting to the human. Okay. So I finish up the part on humanism, and don't worry, the other part of our non-humanism is much shorter than the human part. So it's not divided evenly into parts. The implications I take it here for the Humean approach to laws of nature are that non-spatiotemporal physics, such as the one that we may encounter in quantum gravity, seems to deprive the Humean of a natural supervenience basis in which to apply some form of free recombination to generate metaphysical possibilities devoid of any necessary connections, as you want in the Humean program. And as I said, this suggests to me that there is a general tension between humanism about laws, this idea of a Humean metaphysics here, and naturalism quite generally. How do we navigate the demands of gluing the worlds without charging that glue nomically, to sort of speak metaphorically again, so that our resulting metaphysics is both sufficiently naturalistic and sufficiently Humean without giving up? We can, of course, give up the Humean project and we're done. So that would be one option, but presumably that's not an option to the Humean. And that may be impossible. We may not be able to look to scientific reasoning while suppressing how it projects necessity and nomic connections into the world. Scientific theories, scientific reasoning is always reasoning that projects such connections into the world. So in a way, the Humean project seems to sort of want to start before you even start that scientific work. Okay, I think that when push comes to shove, humanism is optional, naturalism is not, but other philosophers may have a different, different taste here. I'm not going to argue for that, but that's my takeaway lesson from this part. All right, now, primitive modality. These are non-Humean approaches. And they are, I sort of pack them together because they are unified, as I see it, by postulating some form of primitive modality in one form or another. So modality is not derivative as it was in the Humean approach. It's put in by hand right at the fundamental level. For instance, primitivism, which is one non-Humean approach, holds that the fundamental physical laws of nature are ontological primitives, as the approach says. They're not analyzable in terms of anything more fundamental than these laws. They're part and parcel of the fundamental ontology of the world. So you may have stuff like this plus the laws. That's what the primitivist says. That's what there is fundamentally. They're irreducible primitive posits. So according to primitivism, what we certainly have some local matters of fact that the Humean was so obsessed about. For instance, we may have an initial configuration or initial state of some system. That system's there. It is in some initial state. And then the laws take over and do some governing. That's the idea. Dispositionalism is an approach where you, strictly speaking, don't have any laws, fundamentally speaking. You have entities with dispositions. The laws, if they exist at all, they're grounded in these fundamentally dispositional or causal aspects or properties of the fundamental degrees of freedom or entities. They arise out of those dispositions. It's dispositions which give rise to behavior as if governed by laws. Laws are derivative from dispositions which themselves inhere in the fundamental objects. So according to dispositionalism, what there is are, again, some local matters of fact, again, maybe the initial configuration, the initial state of the system, something like that, plus the dispositions that system has or its parts have. And then the dispositions take over and do the governing, as it were, govern the behavior as the behavior unfolds of that system. Okay. Whatever their differences may be, and primitivists and dispositionalists may be shocked to see that they're put in the same boat here, but I think they can be for our purposes, for my purposes today, because the crucial common feature of both approaches is that they involve some form of irreducible primitive modality. Whether that's in the form of laws or dispositions is not so important for my purposes here. It's that primitive modality which gives rise then to the sort of how the world evolves, as it were. Okay. From their perspective, the Humean mosaic, the full four-dimensional arrangement of local qualities, is derived. It's derived from the state of the world at some time, plus the laws or plus the dispositions. Something like that. So, and that's what's advantage, or often considered to be the advantage of those approaches. You don't have to sort of assume the full four-dimensional arrangement, the full four-dimensional Humean mosaic, which according to the non-Humeans is a lot to assume. They think it's much more elegant to just stipulate a sort of a very small sliver of that reality plus something else that generates everything else. That's the idea. Sorry. Tim Maudlin is one prominent example that I like here because he's so explicit about all of this. It's wonderful to quote from him. He says, the total state of the universe is the product of the operation of the laws on the initial state, capturing that idea that I've tried to articulate. In the dispositionalist approach, of course, we have the nature or the essence or the causal power, which somehow adheres to the fundamental physical objects or maybe encoded in the fundamental physical properties which produce their effects. So we have a sense of production, of nomic production here, that is central to these non-Humean approaches, non-Humean governance, if you want. Here's Maudlin again. The basic temporal asymmetry of past to future underlies the very notion of production itself, so that without it there can be no production. Okay, I mean, that's as explicit as it gets, that you need something like time. You have a spatial, that's implicit, but you have a spatial arrangement of some of the way things are at the moment in time. But then you have time, And you have this production over time, okay? So at least to the extent to which they rely on this idea of production, these non-Humean approaches require a fundamental space-time. To be completely fair, Maudlin, of course, understands that perhaps this needs to be revisited, in particular fundamental physics tells us that this is not the right way to think about fundamental physics. Future physics may challenge the notion of time itself, and if it does, that idea cannot be quite the right idea. Anyway, it's obvious that if a theory in quantum gravity will be borne out in which we don't have fundamental time, for instance, we will need to replace that idea of nomic production by an idea of nomic production that's not hostage to time in any way. So we need a non-temporal form of production. That's it. Okay. The idea would have to be something like there's some fundamental facts plus some irreducible dispositions or some primitive laws, which in some non-temporal sense give rise to the totality there is, everything there is. In other words, the nomic voltage needs to be specified in a non-spatial temporal sense. It cannot be specified in this in sort of dynamical picture of evolution. As an example, maybe we could use again the non-temporal distinction between kinematic and dynamical structures in causal set theory and the loop quantum gravity. So there are some ways in which we draw that distinction in those theories, and that's not a temporal distinction. And perhaps we could use that again to our advantage. Anyway, in the paper and in my work, I have not worked this out in any detail. That's a matter of future work, I suppose. But I think it's not trivial to sort of articulate a way in which you could somehow pick a small part of the fundamental quantum gravitational structure to be given plus the laws or the dispositions to generate the totality. How should you think about this in some form of production that doesn't have this temporal aspect? I'm not sure how to do that. I should add, maybe that would be the right place to add. Eddie Chang has sent me emails yesterday and the day before yesterday in which he insisted that his new approach, primitivist approach to laws of nature, does not require a temporal understanding of production. So I wouldn't want to be bound by the claim that there's absolutely no way to do that. What I do want to claim is that the most prominent and most obvious versions, most known versions of these approaches, they are not sufficiently independent of spatiotemporal notions, and as they ought to be, if they want to be workable in quantum gravity. Okay. So, conclusion. If we accept that space-time may disappear at the fundamental level, then, if that's the case, this would force perhaps a very radical reconception of what it is to be a law of nature. We really have to go back to our drawing boards. And this seems to me to be the case for any of the three major approaches we looked at, for major approaches, non-human approaches, as well as for humans. Even though the specific challenge to each of them will be different, of course. The required revisions, in fact, in some cases, they seem to be rather radical. In fact, they may be so radical that you can start to ask yourself whether these approaches would survive into the quantum gravitational case. Maybe it is better to start from scratch and articulate an altogether different way of conceiving of laws of nature. Of course, you could say, yeah, come on, Chris, this is, let's not be fundamentalists. Let's be contingentists or something like that. Whether or not laws arise is a contingent fact of the matter. It's a non-fundamental thing. In some world, there are laws, in others, there are none. Maybe that's what it is. If space-time, which seemed to be so ineliminable and, to Larry's Clark, so completely impossible to not have, even inconceivable, except if you're a Pythagorean or something. Perhaps laws should go the same way, and we shouldn't be too concerned with that. Of course, if we accept that, then we have to accept that the fundamental theories which describe that quantum gravity level will not be able to be analyzed, will not be amenable to an analysis in philosophy of science as we would normally do, at least in physics, in terms of laws of nature. That will not be available. Or we could, of course, go Nancy Cartwright or something like that and say, well, yeah, all the more reason to think that really we should not be at all thinking in terms of laws of nature. Now, of course, that may be the right way to go, but the question still is, and even in cases like Nancy Cartwright, for instance, it's not the case that you don't have any modality. You still do have modality. You have powers or something, and whatever you're going to replace the laws of nature with would have to be similarly independent of space-time. Thank you very much.